Welcome to a brief teacup-size introduction to perceptual control theory, PCT. PCT is a revolutionary theory of the behavior of humans and other living things. This introduction will describe the basics of PCT and show why it is revolutionary. PCT started when William T. Powers, the developer of PCT, asked himself, "What is behavior?" Powers was a student in a graduate program in experimental psychology at the time, and he wanted to understand what it was that he was studying. The conventional answer was, and still is, that behavior is something we can see a person doing, like being aggressive or delaying gratification. These doings are presumably caused by the brain sending commands to the muscles that result in the behavior we see. In technical terms, the conventional view is that behavior is caused output. But this answer didn't satisfy Powers, who, after looking at behavior carefully, came to virtually the opposite conclusion. Behavior is controlled input. In the next few slides, we will show you how Powers came to this conclusion, which provided the basis for his development of PCT. We'll start the way Powers did, by taking a close look at behavior itself. The behavior we'll look at is sipping tea. Looking at this behavior, it is easy to see why the conventional view of behavior has prevailed in psychology. Sipping tea seems to be an output emitted by the lady seated at the table. What is emitted is the movement of the arm that lifts the cup to the mouth and then returns it to the table. One can imagine a simple mechanical device that could produce this behavior. The device would have an arm attached to the cup, and a computer in the device, the equivalent of the lady's brain, would be programmed to move the arm so that the cup is consistently moved to the device's mouth and then set back down on the table. In this case, sipping tea would clearly be an output emitted by the device, just as it appears to be an output emitted by the lady. But Powers was able to look at this behavior and see that it could not possibly be an output produced as we imagined it to be by our mechanical device. Powers could see this because he was able to look at behavior through what we now call control theory glasses, which means he was able to see that sipping tea is done in a world of constantly varying physical disturbances. This means that there is more to sipping tea than simply emitting consistent arm movements. This is what sipping tea looks like through control theory glasses. We still see the lady sipping tea, but we also see that this is happening in the context of disturbances. The disturbances, which are represented by the variations in the length of the red arrow, are only seen in the mind's eye, but Powers, having been trained in physics, knew they were there. When sipping tea, disturbances are the varying forces that are acting on the cup that would make it impossible to consistently move the cup to the lips if, like our mechanical device, the lady were doing the same thing each time she took a sip. The most obvious disturbance in this situation is the change in the weight of the cup after each sip. If the same output force were used to lift the cup for each sip, the lady would be throwing the tea into her face by the second or third sip. There are also other unpredictable varying forces acting on the cup during each sip, so the disturbance arrow varies in length throughout each sip as well as from sip to sip. Through control theory glasses, Powers could also see that in order to consistently move the cup smoothly and accurately to the lips, the lady has to be producing outputs that resist the effects of the disturbances and at the same time move the cup to the lips and back to the table. These outputs are represented by the green arrow. The output arrow points in the opposite direction as the disturbance arrow to show that these outputs are pushing back against the disturbances. The variation in the length of the output arrow shows how forcefully the output is pushing back. The length of the output arrow varies in direct proportion to the length of the disturbance arrow, to show that the output is precisely countering the disturbances while at the same time moving the cup slowly from table to lips and back. What we are seeing here is control. which is the process of keeping a variable, the controlled variable, in a pre-selected state, protected from the effects of disturbances. When sipping tea, the controlled variable is the position of the teacup. The pre-selected state of this variable is the cup moving consistently from table to lips and back, and the disturbances are the forces acting on the cup that would keep this from happening if they went unopposed. Powers realized that all behavior must be like the behavior you see here, because all behavior involves consistently producing pre-selected results in a disturbance-prone world where such consistency is not expected. So he concluded that all behavior is control, and that in order to understand how behavior works, we have to understand how control works. This understanding is provided by PCT. PCT is a model of what's going on inside a behaving system that makes control possible. The PCT model contains an input function that converts the controlled variable, the position of the teacup, into a perception that is an analog of that variable. This perception is compared to a reference signal, which is a specification of the desired value of the perception. The comparator computes the difference between perception and reference. This difference, called error, drives the outputs via the output function. The outputs are the lifting forces that have an effect on the controlled variable. These output effects are the ones we saw through control theory glasses. The model also shows the disturbances that we saw through control theory glasses. According to PCT, the behavior we see as sipping tea results from variations in the reference signal that specify the position of the cup. Notice that the arrow representing the reference signal goes smoothly up and down. The reference signal is telling the perception to do this. Since the perception is an analog of the position of the cup, when the perception goes smoothly up and down, so does the cup. The cup follows the orders of the reference signal because it is part of a feedback loop. If the cup were not in a feedback loop, the disturbances that are continuously pushing on the cup would quickly push it away from the course that is specified by the reference signal. This doesn't happen because the teacup is part of a feedback loop. When the disturbance starts to push the cup from its reference position, the perception of the cup starts to change, and the error increases slightly, which increases the output in a way that pushes back against the disturbance. The result is that the perception of the cup, and of course the cup itself, moves where the reference signal, and not the disturbance, wants it to move. Notice that the error, indicated by the length of the arrow going from comparator to output, doesn't seem to change at all. This is because it takes very little error, less than would show up in the diagram, to cause the outputs that oppose the disturbance. The result is that the disturbance has virtually no effect on the controlled variable, and the cup moves slowly from table to lips and back to table. The closed loop keeps the variations in the perception of the position of the cup matching the variations in the reference signal almost exactly. This can be seen in the animation, which shows the value of the perception varying right along with the variations in the reference signal. What we are seeing here is control of perception. The closed loop is forcing the perception of the cup to match the changing reference signal while protecting it from the disturbances. An important thing to notice about this process is that the lady's outputs, the variations in the height of the green arrow, look nothing like her behavior, the variations in the position of the teacup. This is why in PCT we say that behavior is the control of perception. The behavior we call sipping tea is the behavior of the perception of the teacup. It is not the behavior of the outputs that produce this perception. This PCT model of sipping tea gives a very simplified view of how a person produces a rather simple behavior. But people do lots of things, some very simple like sipping tea, and some very complex like running for political office. The PCT model accounts for this range of behaviors by assuming that people are made up of many control systems, each one like the one shown here. The main difference between them is that they control different kinds of perceptions. Some control simple perceptions like the teacup's position relative to the lips, and some control very complex perceptions like the politician's position regarding taxes. These control systems are assumed to be arranged in a hierarchy as shown here. This hierarchy is made up of many individual control systems like the one that controls for sipping tea. Each system consists of 3 boxes labeled I, C, and O for input, comparator, and output. The systems at the bottom of the hierarchy are controlling the simplest perceptions, and those at the top are controlling the most complex ones. This hierarchical arrangement is nice because it explains something we kind of skipped over when we talked about the model for sipping tea. That is, what is it that varies the reference signals that specify the varying position of the teacup? What does this, according to the hierarchical model, are higher level systems in the hierarchy. This is shown in the diagram by the lines going from the output functions of the systems at level 2 into the comparators of the systems at level 1. What is going on is that the level 2 systems are using the level 1 systems as the means of controlling their own perceptions. For example, one of the level 2 systems might be controlling for a perception like drinking a cup of tea. It produces this perception by varying the reference to the level 1 system that moves the cup from table to lips and back in order to take the sips of tea needed to drink the entire teacup. And the reference for the level 2 drink a cup of tea control system can be varied by a still higher level system that might be controlling for having lunch, which involves controlling for both a perception of drinking a cup of tea and eating a sandwich. With the introduction of the hierarchy, you can see that there is much more to PCT than will fit in a teacup-size introduction, but I hope that this introduction to the basics of PCT has given you a taste for both its ability to explain behavior and its revolutionary nature.